Hello, everyone. Today we are doing a screencast on Sacco and Vanzetti. So either way, you are in for the greatest story, well, an average story at least, about Sacco and Vanzetti. So let's get started. Now, some people call this the trial of the century. Now, there's a lot of important trials, but this was absolutely one of them. Captured the attention of the world. Sacco and Vanzetti definitely got into a wee bit of trouble, and we have a bunch of lessons that we can kind of glean from this, and that's why we're telling the story. So let's get at it. Let's learn this Sacco and Vanzetti story. Now, Vanzetti was from a part of Italy that I'm not going to try to pronounce, and Sacco was from a part of Italy that I'm still not going to try to pronounce. But either way, in 1908, they left Italy, like a lot of immigrants did, and they traveled to the land of opportunity, the United States. Now, as time went by, they probably wouldn't describe it as the land of opportunity. Sacco lived in Stoughton, and Vanzetti lived in a town called Plymouth. And yes, as we can see, these are all kind of close to even Braintree. You can make that case. Now, we know where they lived, but what were they doing with their time? Vanzetti was a fish peddler, something I've never had the honor of doing. And Sacco made shoes, something I also have never done. I guess this isn't about me, though. Now, as the years went by, Sacco and Vanzetti, they became angry, frustrated. It seemed they were working to death 50, 60, 70 hours a week and still had no money at the end of it. No money. Things just didn't seem fair. It seemed like the wealthy, the business owners were taking advantage of them and the working class, that capitalism was evil, and it was just an awful thing. They hated their lives, or should I say the lives that were forced upon them by society. So because of this anger, they kind of changed from a socialist attitude to an anarchist attitude, which aren't so far apart depending on your point of view. And so they were, what do we think about this? I'm sorry, this slide was supposed to prompt me to say, what is anarchism? And anarchism is basically this belief that the government is bad, that we need to get rid of government. Government should not be in society. Now, why did the anarchists and Sacco and Vanzetti blame government? Well, three reasons we can talk about. Number one, government makes laws, thousands of laws, and every single one of them, 100% of them, take freedom away from you. Think about it. Every single law is telling you something you can't do. And who is the government? Why do they have that power to tell you what you can and cannot do? People should live to be free. That's the American way. So here's an anarchist quote. Abolish government and men would be free. And it's all about freedom for them. Number two reason why anarchists hate government. Government is a tool of the rich. Basically, government is run and owned by the rich, and it's used to basically hold down the working class and keep them in poverty. Now, a very tangible example of this is every time workers try to fight for a little bit of fairness, let's say through a strike or a protest, often the government calls in either the army, military, the police force to come in and break up those strikes. Often these strikes get violent and the working class get beat up and forced to go work. Sometimes it's through court decisions, injunctions that shut down strikes. And anarchists would see those strikes as something fair that workers do to try to create a little equity. Here's an anarchist quote. No governments could possibly serve humanity. Instead, governments watch over, inspect, spy, direct, regulate, preach at, and control people. So what's the third reason why anarchists hated government? 1917 is going to exacerbate the situation. World War I occurs, and the United States goes to Europe to fight. Now, they didn't have enough soldiers in America, so what did the U.S. do? Draft people, conscript them, force Americans, quite often not the wealthy, but the working class, to go fight. And if you refuse to fight, if you refuse to give up your job and your family and go off and fight, you were thrown in prison. Sacco and Vanzetti were angry about this, and anarchists were angry. This was the absolute highlight of how government obstructs freedom and ruins lives. So I thought we were a free country in America. That's why they left Italy to come to the US. So Sacco and Vanzetti, along with hundreds of anarchists, fled to Mexico during World War I. They didn't want to be imprisoned. Now the war ends and they come home. And when the anarchists came home, they were still very, very angry. Why? Well, for 2 years, they had to give up their home, leave their families. It was usually just the men, the fathers that left. And reason two, Sacco and Vanzetti were upset because those that didn't flee Mexico stuck around to protest, and they were beat up, arrested, thrown in prison. And even, reason three why they're against the government, in 1918, 1919, things got even worse than that. Example, the Sedition Act basically said you couldn't protest the war or the government. And if you did, if you just said things or published things, you could be thrown in prison. And in fact, hundreds were. So that brings us to 1920. So the anarchists are just angry, mad. They think the US government is evil. All governments are generally evil. And there seems to be an active revolution or war between the anarchists and the US government. Now, you could call this the Red Scare. Now, part of this, we have already talked about this in a previous screencast, how dissenters were locked up under the Sedition Act. Red flags were banned in some states. Socialist parades were attacked and banned. Socialists were physically attacked, and typically they were the ones getting arrested. Socialists were expelled out of the legislature that they were legally elected into. The Palmer raids violated privacy rights. Illegal taps violated privacy. Radicals were deported. Freedom of speech was obstructed. Bombs were sent in the mail by anarchists to many public officials. Assassination attempts like A. Mitchell Palmer and others. So really there was just a war going on in both directions. And here's a quote from Sacco: "Revolution peaceful if possible, but violent if necessary." And here's Vanzetti's quote: "Violence is righteous retaliation against those who jailed, deported, and killed their comrades on the picket lines." So they basically, both Sacco and Vanzetti, along with anarchists, see this as a war. And violence is okay. In fact, violence is needed to defeat this evil enemy that is the government. So anarchists see government as evil and the enemy, and that's their perspective. And government sees anarchists are the enemy. And that's kind of where we are in 1920. And both sides think they're right, and both sides think the other side is evil. But unfortunately, well, I'm not going to say unfortunately, but unfortunately for Sacco and Vanzetti, they are in the extreme minority. Most of society is against them. Anarchists are seen as radicals, unique. So that brings us to April 15th, 1920. That's kind of the context of what happens on April 15th. So in Braintree, Massachusetts, which of course is a town I've never been. No, I've been. We come to Pearl Street. So Pearl Street, of course, looks like this today. And of course, Sacco and Vanzetti, where the story is going to take place is not where the post office is and so on. It's going to be up the street a little bit here. And back in, early 1920s, this is going to be a shoe company in Braintree. And around 3 p.m., Frederick Parmenter, I can't pronounce names apparently, he's going to have $15,000. And what he's going to do is he has to pay the shoe workers, those in the shoe factory. Now, from his office to the factory where the workers are waiting for their money is about a half mile. Apparently, his car has no or almost no gas. And he says, you know what, I'm just going to walk, which is always the smart thing to do when you have lots of money. And he has a guard, though, who is armed, and that's going to protect him, so that he's going to be totally safe, of course. And then they're walking down the street, Frederick Parmenter and Alexandro Buridelli, and they're walking, and suddenly a car races up, which I guess you could predict, and two men get out, and there's a robbery. And what happens? A murder. So the two men that get out, rob and then murder those two people. So Frederick Parmenter was basically unarmed. He was carrying the money, and he was shot twice, including a fatal shot to the back when he was running away, which is going to make this seem awful. And not that it wouldn't be awful either way, but Baridelli, which was the armed guard, is shot 4 times, including when he was already down, he was shot in the head. Now, the criminal taking the money is then going to get into the car, and now later on this is going to be perceived by society to be Sacco, but we're not saying that's true. He's going to hop in the car, and they're going to drive away, and apparently there were a bunch of people in the car. Nobody knows how many people were in the car, but at least 2, but probably more. Now they start firing guns while driving away at the workers that are looking at them, maybe just as a distraction, maybe not trying to hit them. The car goes off from Braintree towards Randolph and Stoughton. So that's what people saw. Now, what people didn't know at the time was they abandoned, half mile away towards Randolph and Stoughton, they abandoned that getaway car and then get into another car that was waiting there, and they leave the getaway car there. Now, Braintree is sad. These 2 Braintree men are killed and they've been robbed, and it's a big crime. They're looking for criminals. They want to catch these jerks that did this. But the good news is immediately they already have a suspect. So on December 24th, 1919, there was already a very similar crime in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, which is not all that far from Braintree. And that was also a murder robbery, and there were Italian suspects. Now, Italian suspects because of eyewitnesses, but also because there were many Italian immigrants at the time that were very much into anarchism, and anarchism was known to be a group of violent people that were advocating against the government and willing to do crimes to take on the government and society. They were against capitalism. Well, at this time, the sheriff of Bridgewater says, you know what? I think that this anarchist that lives over here, Coachi, did both of the crimes, him and his friends. And now Coachi was a part of this group called the Galanist. I can't pronounce that, but this group, this family, they basically published this anarchist newsletter, and they were known to be behind the bombings that happened in 1919 instead of bombs sent around the country. Basically, this is the leading group of anarchists in America at the time. And so this person, again, Coachi, lives, I believe, in Bridgewater, and he is the suspect in that crime and this Braintree crime. So the sheriff basically contacts the Braintree sheriff, and they say, hey, this guy lives over here. Why don't you come over and let's go talk to him? Now, Coachi is roommates with a guy named Mike Boda. Now, the reason why this is relevant is Coachi is going to be deported this time, and he's actually going to be out of the country. But Boda was there in Coachi's house. So when the police go there, they see Boda. So they basically go to talk to Boda. They're like, oh, so you live here. Where's your car? We had this strange, not everybody had a car back then. And if this crime was done, it had to be done in a car. So they wanted to see his car, but the car was missing. It was getting repaired. So Boda says it's getting repaired. So the police go to the repair facility to check out the car to see if this might have been the one that was used in the crime, or the second car. So they end up thinking that it's actually the second car that was used in the Braintree crime, when they dropped the getaway car. So the police say, let's sit on this and let's wait to see who picks up the car. It's probably going to be the bad guys that were involved with both crimes, particularly the Braintree crime. So on May 5th, 1920, 4 men show up to get the car. And two of them are, one of them is Boda, but two of them are Sacco and Vanzetti, who have now entered into this situation. Now, they walk away from the garage and they actually board a streetcar to return home, and the police raid the streetcar. So now, what do they find on Sacco and Vanzetti at the time? They find them both carrying guns, which was a very unusual thing for Massachusetts at the time. They were both anarchists carrying guns, a group known to be somewhat violent, and this makes them look very, very bad. And they had motive. Basically, anarchists committed crime to basically attack capitalist society and the government, but also to fund future anarchist events. So they were arrested at that moment on that streetcar. Now, on May 5th, 1920, they were charged, meaning the same day, with this crime, and it causes an eruption across the world. Basically, this got a lot of publicity, and the whole world saw this as them getting arrested, not because of evidence against them, but because of massive U.S. prejudice. And this, everybody that was upset at the United States, this was just more evidence that the U.S. was racist and a bunch of jerks that were taking on the underprivileged of society and treating them terribly. So this is going to ignite hatred that already existed. So hatred against, prejudice against immigrants, particularly Italian immigrants and anarchists in general. That's the way the world saw this, that the U.S. was picking on these groups, that the government had anarchists in their crosshairs going after them, which of course during the Red Scare, the government was doing that. So the world's super angry, and we basically, yes, we knew it. See, the U.S. is going after these people, these immigrants, these Italians, these anarchists, not because of evidence, but because of their political beliefs. So the U.S., bam, thousands of cities across the world, New York City, London, thousands erupt in protests. How could the U.S. be doing this? So, and again, here are some of those protests. Ghastly miscarriage of justice, and shall capitalists murder our fighters? Basically, this was seen as the rich and powerful, the U.S. government taking on the working class. So here's a famous quote. You are a great people. You ought to be a just people. A case by which the soul of a people is tested and displayed. People thought that this case, this trial was going to show if the United States was truly a just country or not. Why was the world upset? H.G. Wells, famous author, basically said, this is not about the guilt or innocence of two Italians. No, this is about whether America can provide a fair trial. America executing political opponents just because they're red or communist, this cannot be okay. When in the middle of the Red Scare, just because you don't like a group of people, you can't be imprisoning them. So that was a huge, me paraphrasing the situation, but you have the exact quote in front of you. Now, on May 21st, 1920, at the Dedham Courthouse, Sacco and Vanzetti are brought in to face trial. That happened much quicker then than today. Today, it would have taken years before that trial happened. But here they are, smiling because there's a big ado. That basically hundreds of people showed up, if not thousands, to basically cheer them on, to support them. And they saw this as, a good for their cause, right? It brought a lot of attention to their anarchist cause. So they have a 2-month trial, and then on July 21st, 1921, they are deemed guilty. And that led to 3 years of protests across the world. 3 years where America was said to be racist, prejudiced against anarchists, against they don't have a fair criminal justice system. America is against immigrants. And, a huge part of that was very, very much true. So for 3 years, the world is debating about this and saying, free these two men, they're innocent. On October 1st, 1924, so years later, finally their lawyers put together an appeal, and Judge Thayer listens to all of these debates, and he rejects all of them. Says, no, absolutely not. You had a trial, you're guilty. No, you're not giving you another trial. 2 years of protests and debates after that, saying the system's unfair, they should have got a second trial, they're innocent. And May 12th, 1926, basically they appeal not to Judge Thayer, not to Dedham or Braintree, but instead to the state Supreme Judicial Court. This is the highest court in Massachusetts, and they appeal. And that gets rejected. They're like, no, we're not giving you another trial. And on April 9th, 1927, now that the appeals were exhausted, Judge Thayer has to sentence them. And here's his quote: I sentence you to suffer the punishment of death by the passage of current of electricity through your body. That's a terrible and horrible thing to say. But on August 22nd, 1927, that sentence is carried out. Vanzetti and Sacco are going to be executed. And Vanzetti is famous for shaking hands with all the guards who are about to kill him and says, I wish to forgive some people for what they're about to do to him. And he's strapped in and he is killed. And both are killed in 1927, about 7 years after that crime. And, here's Sacco just dead, just killed, executed. We want to take a look at what the United States or Massachusetts or those courts or the judicial system did, of course, to him. They were murdered, according to some. And here's the funeral procession in Boston. As again, they were martyrs. Much of the world saw their death as the United States murdering people. Now, from 1927 to 1977, everybody's wondering, were they innocent? And, half the world disagreed with the other half. Did they receive a fair trial? Does this prove that the U.S. is abusive to civil liberties when it comes to unpopular groups like anarchists or Italians or immigrants? And in 1977, Massachusetts had a governor, and his name was Michael Dukakis. He would later run for president in 1988. But either way, he gives a proclamation announcement. He says that the trial was permeated by prejudice against foreigners and hostility and towards unorthodox political views, basically saying the trial was filled with bias, prejudice, and therefore it was unfair. And he announces that Sacco and Vanzetti should be forgiven and considered innocent. Any disgrace should be forever removed from their names. So you could say people felt vindicated. Now, from 1977 to today, people still wonder, even with that governor's pronouncement, were they innocent? Did they receive a fair trial? What does that trial say about America? Were we truly full of prejudice? Are we still? What can we learn from that trial? And that's kind of what this presentation is about. So those are the things we are wondering. So let's dive into it. Were they guilty? Did they receive an unfair trial? Let's look at some of the evidence. Okay, so number one. The first couple points here we're going to focus on why they might be guilty. Okay, so they did, when they first were taken in that streetcar, they lied to the police about having weapons. They said right away, we don't have any weapons on us. And of course, Sacco had this weapon, a Colt, and Vanzetti had this weapon. These are the literal weapons, pictures of them. So they lied to the police. Usually people that lie to the police about something are guilty. Now, of course, I might say that if I was an anarchist being targeted by the government, I might lie to the police too, so I wouldn't be arrested. So there's some logic behind that. But the fact that they were carrying weapons and then lied about it, both really made people, those were the primary reasons they were arrested. You can make a case. Number two, they had lots of ammunition on them, not just guns, but they carried a lot of ammunition. Sacco had 23 .32 caliber cartridges on them. Now that's a lot of ammunition. I don't know why you'd be carrying that much. Maybe just to defend yourself, maybe. I don't know. Vanzetti had shotgun shells on him. And that is going to really, again, make people question them. Why were you so heavily armed? Number three, Sacco's ammunition were the same. Those Sacco's ammunition that he had on him were the same shells used at the scene. Now they were produced by Peters and Remington. Now I'm not a gun person. I don't know a lot about that, but apparently you could buy ammunition produced by lots of different groups, and the fact that he had the ones produced by the same group that were used in the robbery, was either a coincidence or kind of an unlikely thing. So they said, oh, that's not a coincidence. He probably used that same ammunition when he robbed Braintree. Number 4, Kouachi. Now remember, he was one of the lead anarchists in the area, and he was the one that originally was suspected to be behind the crime. He had worked at both shoe factories, the one that got robbed in Bridgewater and the one that got robbed in Braintree. Now that is a major coincidence because remember, he's the guy that lived with Mike Boda and was really good friends with Sacco and Vanzetti. And with that friendship, I mean, was that just a coincidence? These two shoe places that both got robbed were 31 minutes away from each other. That's a huge coincidence that he worked at both. Could it be the implication was that maybe he worked at both and was scouting them out and knew exactly where the money would be and where to rob these people and when to rob these people? Sacco and Vanzetti were his friends. So that couldn't be a coincidence, right? No. That's the link here. That's why both places would get robbed. And Sacco and Vanzetti justifies them being there. It gives them an idea. So number 5, several witnesses thought they saw Vanzetti at the scene. So a bunch of witnesses saw Vanzetti. When you look at him, he is easy to see. Look at his mustache. He doesn't look like most people. That mustache is absolutely unique. So when people testify that they saw him, we saw him look in the car, we saw him firing. I mean, he's tough to mistake, right? He doesn't look like other people. So, I don't know, coincidence? Number 6, Sacco was not at work. Sacco. So what the idea is, Sacco went to work every day, and then people were like, well, no, he couldn't have done this crime because he was at work. So when they went to his work, they're like, no, he was absent this day. Now that sounds like a weird coincidence, doesn't it? He just happened to be absent on the day of this crime, didn't have an alibi. So that made him look pretty guilty. Number 7, Sacco and Vanzetti both had been seen in the area that morning of the crime. Now, what that basically means is a bunch of people testified at the trial that they saw him hanging around and even saw the car hanging around before the crime. Now, for somebody who lives in Stoughton and Plymouth, why were they hanging out in Braintree? That couldn't be just a coincidence. Now, some people say, well, eyewitnesses aren't that reliable. You play tricks in your mind. You think you saw certain people. So people aren't really sure about those witnesses, but they testified, and that's a big coincidence that they were seen around Braintree in the morning. Number 8, a hat was found at the scene of the crime, and it could have been Sacco's. So eyewitnesses basically found that hat, and that's the actual cap right here, and that looked just like the hat that Sacco usually wore to work. And he was even known to hang that hat up when he went to work every single day. And when they looked at this cap that was found at the scene of the crime, there was a hole in it, and he was known for having a hole in his hat he used the hole to hang it on a nail at his work. So a big coincidence right there. Now, that hole later, like 5 years later, the police chief said, well, I actually made the hole in the hat when I was looking in the hat for evidence. So that's going to be discounted later, but that didn't help with the original trial. Now, number 9, there's a guy named Carlos Goodridge in his testimony. He was the top witness at the trial. He basically was a worker at the factory, and he was 25 feet away from the car, and he said, I saw them. I saw Sacco, I saw him shoot the police guard. I saw him, was only 25 feet away. Bam, I caught him. And this was probably the number 1 piece of evidence, this eyewitness, and so on. So again, coincidence? I mean, he saw Sacco. Now, again, a lot of people say eyewitnesses aren't that credible, but hey, I saw him do it. Number 9, they lied to the police about being anarchists. Right when they got arrested at the very beginning, they said, we're not anarchists. And of course, that was a lie. They were very much anarchists. And people that lie usually have something to hide, and maybe they're hiding that they committed this crime. Now, of course, right away, Vanzetti was found with anarchist literature on him. So that's how we know he was lying, but of course, other reasons since then. But the explanation here is anarchists were being hunted. So of course, they're going to lie about being anarchists. But no, the prosecution used that as, look, they're lying. They're not trustworthy. They must have had something to hide. And of course, Sacco and Vanzetti emphasized at the trial that the Palmer raids that were going on, they were targeted. They were being attacked. Of course, they're going to try to hide. Number 10, Sacco's bullets were so rare, the bullets that were found on him when they were arrested, and they were an exact match. Now, we talked about who produced those bullets, but a ballistics witness basically said that the gun, those type of bullets were discontinued, and they were so obsolete that the trial people couldn't even find similar bullets to compare them to. The only bullets they could find were the ones in Sacco's pockets. That gun that was so rare that needed those bullets. So these bullets were so rare that he's basically saying that these bullets aren't everywhere. In fact, the only bullets they could find were in his pockets. So it's very, very, very likely that he was the one that used these bullets at the crime scene, because you're not going to find these bullets in every other person who has a gun. In fact, if you searched 100 people, probably none of them would have it, is what the prosecution said. Number 11, Vanzetti's gun matched the missing gun. So what does that mean exactly? Well, Vanzetti, this was the gun that was found on him, was identical to the gun that belonged to Baradelli. Now, Baradelli was the security guard that was killed, right? Shot 4 times. Now, the thing about it is his gun was missing. Now, when they searched the dead man's body, the security guard, he had a holster on, and there was no gun there. So the implication, even though there was never any proof, was that one of the killers took the gun, which makes sense, right? Took the gun and kept it. And Vanzetti had a gun that was perceived to be his. Now, there's a lot of debate about that, but that was what was thought. So again, the gun was missing from Pearl Street. So number 12, bullet number 3 from the crime scene. All these bullets that were within the victims, and of course the bullet cases. They did forensics on the gun that was found on Sacco. And so basically, forensics is a complicated science, but basically one aspect of forensics is every gun barrel has imperfections on the inside of it. Now, the gun barrel, of course, is where the bullet's shot through. And those imperfections leave scratches on the bullet. And every single gun leaves a very specific set of scratches that are unique to that gun. So the way that you can trace a bullet to a gun is you look at the scratches. It's essentially like a fingerprint. Well, in 1926, technology was not the same today, but they looked at bullet number 3, which they got out of the body of the person who'd been killed, or one of them, from the crime scene, and they compared those scratches with bullets that they fired during the trial from Sacco's Colt. So the gun that they seized, they fired more bullets out of it and compared the new bullets that were fired during the trial process with the bullets that were fired during the crime, and they were a match, the same scratches, which showed that the bullets used at the crime scene were the same ones that came from Sacco's gun. Now, if this is true, this is pretty much evidence that they're guilty. Now, in 1926, technology was not perfect, and there was a lot of debate about these scratches, but that gun was then retested in 1935 for the same reason, and it was verified. Yeah, these are the same scratches. In 1961, people were like, this can't be, let me test it again. And now with greater technologies, they said, yep, the bullets used at the crime scene were from Sacco's gun. And then in 1983, they're like, let's test this again. We don't trust it. And again, it was confirmed. So you could make a case that we're almost 100% certain that the gun that was found on Sacco was the gun used at the crime scene. And that's from 80 years of technology. So now, what was questionable about this is technically some people then said, no, the prosecution must have switched out the gun, taken the real gun found on Sacco and replaced it with another gun, and then fired bullets from that new gun. And clearly the evidence was tampered here. And if you believe that, then Sacco would be innocent. He was set up. But other people say that barrels were exchanged. It wasn't just the gun was replaced, but you can take these guns apart into pieces, and they just switched the barrel, the part that provides that fingerprint, the scraping of the bullets. And that way it would look like the old gun, but actually part of it had been switched. So a lot of people were accusing that the prosecution was so hated anarchists so much that they were willing to do anything to convict them. 13, Upton Sinclair was told by Fred Moore that Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty. Upton Sinclair was a famous muckraker. He did that famous book, The Jungle, where he took down meatpacking plants with Teddy Roosevelt. And in 1928, the world was on fire. They're like, the U.S. is terrible. They're attacking anarchists. So Upton Sinclair did an investigation and wrote a book about this. And he talked to the defense attorneys, the attorney that was fighting for Sacco and Vanzetti, a famous socialist lawyer. And Fred Moore basically told him after they'd been executed that Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty. And, Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty. His own clients were guilty. And he had been the one that had coached them and supplied them with fake alibis. So, outside of the ethical aspects of this, he was being honest, Upton Sinclair, and basically said, yeah, they were guilty, but my job was to, fight for them, fight for the greater cause. So I hooked him up with fake alibis. So I don't know. Did he have any reason to lie? Was he trying to become famous? You could make a case. Why would Fred Moore lie? Technically, he'd lose his lawyer's license for betraying his clients, right? So, but their own lawyer basically said they were guilty. So pretty damning, I think. Number 14, Mike Buda. Remember, Mike Buda was the one that picked up the car with them, was in the house but the original house that the police went to, he later in his life said that Sacco was indeed part of the crime. Basically, a guy named Charles Poggi, years and years later, in 1955, traveled to Italy and found a very old Mike Boda, and because Mike Boda had since moved there, right, to escape the U.S. And Sacco was there. What Boda said, yeah, trust me, he was there, and this guy, again, Charles Poggi, basically got the suspicion that Boda was there too. He was in the car as well. But Boda told him Sacco was there. So it depends on whether you believe this Charles Poggi, if he was credible or whatnot. So number 15, both admit that they are willing to use violence. And by both, I mean Sacco and Vanzetti. They are very well, if you look at their writings, they both said that they were willing to use violence to achieve the anarchist cause, to fight against capitalists. And if people are admitting that they're willing to use violence and they're carrying guns and bullets, why would this robbery have been something they wouldn't do? I think very much that they would have done it. So that doesn't mean they did it, just that they very much could have done it and would be willing to do it. So again, that's kind of damning towards them. And number 16, both of these gentlemen, Sacco and Vanzetti, had ties. We have proof of their correspondence and working together with the anarchists that were responsible for the 1919 bombings, of sending out 30 bombs to prominent people across U.S. society. And we don't know if they were involved with the bombs or just were great friends with them, but we have suspicions that they either supported the efforts or possibly could have. Now, either way, that shows that they were kind of the type of people that, again, would use violence and do things like this. Now, those are a lot of the reasons why they could be guilty, or one of them could be guilty. Now let's talk about the reasons why so many people doubt that they were guilty, or think at least they didn't get a fair trial. Number one reason, Judge Thayer, who was in charge of the trial, was completely biased against them and did not give them a fair trial. Now, this is probably the number one reason why people are upset. Now, Judge Thayer, weeks before the trial even started, gave a huge damning speech about how communism and anarchism are evil. And now he's responsible for the life of anarchists that are on trial. Doesn't seem fair. In 1924, after the trial, he's listening to appeals and he rejects all of them. And many people thought the appeals were reasonable. Now, here's a quote from him. "Did you see what I did to those anarchist bastards the other day? I guess that will hold them for a while. Let them go now and see what they can get out of the Supreme Court." Basically showing that he hated them. And that hate certainly could have biased his decisions, or maybe he hated them and was completely objective. Now, but definitely that questions whether they got a fair trial with a judge that was so biased. Now, number two reason why we must doubt this process. 16 witnesses testified during that trial that say Vanzetti was in Plymouth. He couldn't have done the crime. I saw him during that time. He was selling ales like he normally did in Plymouth on that day, and they bought them from him. Now, people are like, how could 16 people say they saw him and were with him at the time of the crime and that just be ignored? They must not have got a fair trial. Now, some people say that at this point, so much of the world, particularly Italian Americans, were 100% sure Sacco and Vanzetti were being prejudiced against, that they would have done anything, including lied, to basically get them to be free. Other people say the jury was completely biased against these 16 people. Because they were Italian, because they were immigrants, because they didn't speak English, and therefore discounted their testimony, which was very legit. Number three, prejudice against those 16 witnesses, which I just kind of talked about. Sacco's alibi was that he was selling fish at the time, and he had 16 people saying they bought fish from him at the time, but they were all from Plymouth, and they were all Italian, and many of them didn't speak English and required interpreters, and the jury basically was like prejudiced against them, discounted what they said as a bunch of liars, a bunch of immigrants, a bunch of Italian immigrants that didn't speak English, and and that type of systemic prejudice, not so good. So again, that's an example of how they did not get a fair trial. The jury was biased against them and all these witnesses. Number four reason why this trial was unfair. The Bridgewater verdict ended up biasing the judge and jury. If you remember, the Braintree crime was only the second crime. The Bridgewater crime was very similar, but it actually was a trial that was going on at the same time and right before. And the verdict came down on from the first trial during the second trial. And what that basically did on July 1st was guilty, that they were guilty of that crime, that murder. And that's going to bias both the judge and the jury. Wow, these people committed some other crime. They must be guilty of this crime and that crime. And that was said to, ultimately result in a biased decision on the Braintree, because the jury thought they were already murders. And I agree. If I thought somebody was a murderer, that would bias how I saw the evidence. Number five reason why this trial might not have been, why there might have been reasonable doubt. They might not have got a fair trial. Defense attorney Fred Moore, the attorney that was representing Sacco and Vanzetti, totally made things worse. He biased the judge against them. Fred Moore was a famous attorney, and he saw this not as this trial not about Sacco Vanzetti, but about the greater cause against capitalism and the government. And he was very kind of flamboyant and kind of obnoxious and battled the judge the whole time. And he angered the judge by basically he would attack the judge. He would take his shoes off in the middle of the trial just to make a point. And basically the judge's hatred for that attorney is going to transfer to the clients, Sacco and Vanzetti. So a famous quote from Judge Thayer was, "I'll show that no long-haired anarchist from California can run this court." So you could almost, you wait till I give my charge to the jury, I'll show them. So their attorney is going to make things worse for them. Not really that fair. So number 6 reason why the trial might not have been fair, Sacco and Vanzetti were escorted to court under heavily armed guards. This trial was so famous that there was a rumor that the courthouse was going to be bombed. Basically, there was heavy security. So they were escorted in with huge guards, and they were held in a cage to protect them, but also to prevent them from escaping. And it just made them look guilty. The jury saw all this commotion, and they heard that these guys were bad. They looked guilty. There's no way that the judge and jury weren't biased with that, with the cage that was set up and all these armed guards and the threats of bombs. They basically made the anarchists look really bad. So number 7 reason why they didn't get a fair trial. The cap was not Sacco's. Basically, that cap that was found that the prosecution said belonged to him, it didn't fit when he tried it on the trial, but the prosecution said, look at it. They made him wear it. And then he's like, this doesn't fit. And they're like, no, it does fit. So it didn't even fit him. It also was a different size than the hats he had at home. But the prosecution said that didn't matter. There was a hole in the cap, and that was later found out that the police chief put the hole there. It wasn't Sacco's hat or the hole. So again, number 8 reason why they didn't get a fair trial. Sacco claimed he was in Boston applying for a passport at the Italian consulate. And the clerk that worked with him to get him a passport, his testimony was completely not counted. He basically, in the meantime, had moved to Italy, and he was unwilling to return. So even though he said, yeah, I remember Sacco, I remember his picture, I worked with him, he couldn't possibly have done the crime, but he was unwilling to return because at that time there were no planes and it would have meant 2 long voyages. And so he swore a deposition, and that was presented and read. But, once again, juries don't really take things like pieces of paper seriously. He would have had to show up for them to take his words seriously. Now, they basically thought he was just lying to support Sacco and Vanzetti, who were very famous Italians at this point. The jury kind of took it as any Italian would lie to save them. So there was no trust for him, particularly because he didn't show up. So that wasn't necessarily fair. And number 9 reason why they didn't get a fair trial, Sacco claims that after he applied for that passport, he had lunch with his friends in Boston. And all of his friends said, yeah, we had lunch with them in the North End. And they testified. But again, the jury didn't trust them, basically thought that they were lying to protect their friend and that they were all just a bunch of jerks that were anarchists. So number 10, eyewitnesses were not trustworthy. This is another example of how they didn't get a fair trial. So one of the top 2 witnesses for the prosecution was a witness named Mary Splain. And she said, no, I saw them, Sacco and Vanzetti. I can point to them. I remember them being there. And of course, the counter to that was, listen, you were 60 to 80 feet away and you are 100% sure you saw them? Yeah, people that you were previously unknown to, traveling at 15 to 18 miles per hour, and you only saw them for a second or two, but you're 100% sure? And she's like, yes. So again, eyewitness territory led to them being guilty. But I mean, you can see that eyewitness was not reliable, yet she was 100% sure. So again, number 11, the jury was totally biased by World War I evidence. Basically, the prosecution brought up that Sacco and Vanzetti during World War I didn't fight to support America. They fled to Mexico. So they were portrayed as evil, unpatriotic. And the jury certainly, people took that pretty seriously when people dodged the war, dodged the draft. So they were very biased against them, thinking that Sacco and Vanzetti were the devil. And that meant, just because they weren't patriotic doesn't mean that they committed this crime. Yet that's probably the way the jury took that. Number 12 reason they didn't get a fair trial. Sacco and Vanzetti testified about their anarchist beliefs. Basically, Sacco and Vanzetti felt that they had to testify that they were anarchists, revealing that they were this group of people that the jury probably hated, because they needed to explain for some reason why they were armed, because that was the biggest thing. Why were these guys carrying guns? They must have been the people that committed the crime, right? So they needed to fight against that, and they basically explained it by saying, no, anarchists are being hunted. We needed to have guns to defend ourselves. And yeah, so basically they had to reveal at the trial that they were anarchists, and we know that the jury in much America hated anarchists and feared them, and the jury would have been biased against them, that this would have turned them not towards the evidence but towards their political biases. 13th reason why they didn't get a fair trial, the jury foreman was proved to be biased. Now, on a jury, you always have one of them selected randomly as the leader, and the leader of the jury before the trial, basically when somebody asked about them, his response to the person who asked him was, damn them, they ought to be hanged anyway. Somebody had brought up that maybe that piece of the evidence wasn't true. And he said, it doesn't matter. They ought to hang anyway, revealing his absolute bias against them, that prejudice. The 14th reason why they didn't get a fair trial, there was this guy named Celestino Medeiros. He actually admitted to the crime after Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted. In 1925, he was accused of murder, most likely had murdered somebody, or most likely was going to be put to death or serve the rest of his life in prison. And then he publicly said, I did the Braintree crime. It wasn't them. I did it. And the judge said, no, I reject this appeal. This guy is not credible. He's a murderer, and he knows he's probably going to spend the rest of his life in jail. So why not try to take credit and help his fellow Italians out? So he rejected that appeal. And the defense was like, are you kidding? We have somebody else who admits to doing it, and you're not going to free Sacco and Vanzetti? Number 15 reason why they didn't get a fair trial, even right before death, they still claimed innocence. So here's Vanzetti saying, I wish to forgive some people for what they're doing to me. You would think he's got nothing to lose. He's on his deathbed. He's about to be killed, that he would admit the truth. And what he admits is, no, I did not do this. I did not. And both Sacco and Vanzetti were known to be great in prison. All the prison guards loved them. They were respectable. They wrote tons of letters. Those letters came out, and they just seemed like good people in those letters. So a lot of people say, no, they couldn't have been the ones to have committed this crime. Number 16 reason why they didn't get a fair trial, the appeals process was inadequate. Basically, the Mass Supreme Judicial Court, to who they appealed to, under the Massachusetts law at the time, they could only look for errors that Judge Thayer had done, judicial errors. They could not look at the evidence. Now, most people said that there was massive bias and that the evidence wasn't good enough. And if they just looked at the evidence, they would know that this was an unfair trial. But, in the appeals process, they weren't allowed to look at evidence, only to find errors that were conducted by Judge Thayer. That's how appeals were handled in Massachusetts back then. And that the system was rigged and unfair. They should have looked at the evidence and realized it was bad and then overturned it, or given them a new trial at least. So that, again, the bias of the judge, the bias of the jury, the bias of the police, none of that could be looked at. And therefore, the appeals process was unfair. So what is the legacy of this crime? We've heard lots of reasons why they might be guilty or innocent. And ultimately, historians in 2020 have come to kind of a consensus that Sacco was probably guilty. He was probably the one that killed the prison guard. And Vanzetti was most likely innocent. And by that, he was probably not in the car. He certainly didn't shoot and kill anyone. He was probably a friend and supporter of this situation, but he didn't commit this exact crime. And another part of the legacy was this trial was not fair. There was massive prejudice all the way around. They could not have got a fair trial given the hatred towards anarchists that was displayed by the judge, by the jury, by the police involved. It was not a fair trial, that the evidence was not handled properly. Another legacy was what we can learn from this crime is that during times of war, times of great fear, that our country, the United States, has a long history of, in the name of national security, of sacrificing civil liberties. During times of great fear, great hate naturally happens. That during times of fear, people immediately identify people to fear and are worried that so many people are a part of them that they treat them very badly. Now, we've done this all throughout history. Whether it was with the Japanese during World War II or communists before that and after that, anarchists around World War I, Arabs and Muslims after 9/11. During times of great fear, people lash out at those that they are afraid against and are willing to sacrifice their liberties. And this happens over and over again in society. So what do we take away from this? It's the idea that we have to really become cognizant that during times of elevated fear, we are at a risk to violate people's rights in the name of national security, and that we need to be aware of that so that we don't do it, and so on. What's another example of legacy? That Society tends to tolerate um, unpopular groups at times, unpopular opinions having their rights sacrificed. Again, we have a long history of people being abused, that whether it's women, African Americans, Catholics, Jews, Irish, Muslims, immigrants, Japanese, communists, anarchists. If a group has an unpopular view, or if there's systemic racism against that group, or prejudice or sexism, our society tends to target those groups, and society tends to let the government get away with it. If we can understand that we have a long history of doing that, we can be mindful of it in the future. And then if we're mindful of it, we can work hard to not let it occur. And that's really kind of the lesson of Sacco and Vanzetti, that we have to know that in times of fear, elevated fear, elevated hate tends to come along, and rights tend to get violated over and over again. Another lesson of the Sacco and Vanzetti is you can't really trust the courtroom of public opinion. During Sacco and Vanzetti, there were millions and millions of people in the US and around the world that were 100% sure that Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty. And there were millions of people that were 100% sure that they were innocent. And all of them pretty much were led by their emotions and not by evidence. So really, when you see millions of people thinking one thing or thinking this or that, you really can't necessarily trust it. You really have to go through that. You have to look at the evidence closely and get through the emotion. Just because millions of people believe something, it does not make it credible. And I think the Sacco and Vanzetti case really hits that home. Right now, this is 2020. I mean, I see on the news millions of people saying that the 2020 presidential election was absolutely a fraud. The voting was rigged, and millions of people think they're crazy. And millions of people that think the election was rigged think the other people are crazy. And we just have to be really careful. A lot of people are led by emotion, not necessarily evidence on both sides. And we have to be super careful of that when we're making public policy, not just to follow public opinion. Now, another lesson of Sacco and Vanzetti is Massachusetts judicial reform, the appeals process. A lot of times, for a long time in Massachusetts, appeals courts could only grant appeals if there was evidence that the trial didn't follow the law correctly. The appeals courts weren't allowed to look at the evidence to see if the judge and juries made mistakes, and that is going to change after Sacco and Vanzetti. Massachusetts by 1938, because of Sacco and Vanzetti, is going to update that and basically saying that those appeals courts are allowed to look at the evidence and are allowed to see if, because of the evidence, if it was interpreted poorly, and therefore another trial should be granted. So that gives, for those that are accused, an extra round of appeals to make sure that injustice is not carried out towards them. And finally, the last legacy is maybe we need to rethink the death penalty. And this was kind of a huge topic in the 70s and 80s, that if Sacco and Vanzetti, if there's so much doubt on their innocence and they were killed or executed anyway, maybe the death penalty isn't the right thing. Maybe we should not have the death penalty if our society has so much bias in it, and therefore innocent people might possibly be put to death. So we should not trust the system, because we can't trust the government to be without prejudice. And that's an argument that people that are against the death penalty feel strongly about. And that was kind of adopted in the 1970s and by many people since. So in the end, Braintree, the town of Braintree, does have a plaque located right at the spot of the murders, right at the spot of the robbery. There's the plaque, down here. You can find Chili's and Tennessee Barbecue, but it's right here and so on. This is the overpass there. McDonald's is back up here. So that's where the rock and the plaque. And of course, here we go. This monument is dedicated to the memory of Frederick Parmenter and Alessandro Buridelli, who were, of course, killed. And I think you should absolutely check this out. A lot of people in Braintree don't even know it's there. Big piece of history. So look for your assignment in Google Classroom.